Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 1 of Lab 2, the cell. In Lab 1, you learned that the human body is very complex, and because of this complexity, it's helpful for us to break the body down into progressively less complex units, and in doing so, we create a hierarchical scheme of body organization. The most basic level of this hierarchical system deals with chemistry, so here we talk about atoms and how those atoms combine to form molecules. For example, one of the key processes that takes place in your body is the formation of water, which involves a chemical reaction between oxygen and hydrogen atoms. From the basic chemical level, we move up the hierarchy, focusing on organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and finally the entire organism. In this lab, we will continue discussing how the body is organized, focusing on the cellular level of organization. We'll talk about the basic structure of the cells that comprise your body, learn about the components of each of those cells, and discuss how each of those components function both individually and as a unit to carry out the biochemical processes necessary to maintain the life of a cell. You should recall from general biology that the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of living things, and there are between 50 and 100 trillion cells that make up the body. Obviously, those trillions of cells are not all identical. In fact, there are over 200 different types of cells found in the body. The differences in those cells are due to a number of factors, including size, shape, and particularly internal makeup. Each of these differences is important because they reflect a cell's specific role in the body. Okay, for example, let's compare a cell of the liver with a cell of the nervous system. Remember that your liver is a filter. It filters the blood, removing harmful substances that are either ingested or produced as a result of food metabolism. This function is obviously quite different from that of the brain, for example, which is responsible for sending and receiving electrical signals that basically coordinate all of our bodily functions. Because the liver and the brain have very different functions, we should expect the cells that make up those organs to have very different functions as well, and consequently, those cells differ in their internal composition. In a liver cell, for example, we would expect to find something capable of removing toxic substances from the blood and breaking those toxins down, whereas cells that make up the brain would not have structures capable of doing this. So keep in mind that a cell's location and function in the body determine the overall composition of the cell. Despite their differences, all cells that make up the body have several common features and functions. For example, cells, like living organisms, ingest and digest nutrients. They metabolize those nutrients. In other words, they break them down and use them to generate energy and to manufacture organic compounds the body needs to survive. Cells, like other living organisms, grow and reproduce, and they also respond to external stimuli. All of these characteristics are the characteristics of life. Remember, we've defined a cell as the basic structural unit of living things. So because cells are the basic components of living things, cells themselves are also living things. Despite being very complex, cells are extremely small. We have to have a microscope in order to see individual cells, and the study of cells is called cytology. In the figure on the screen, you can see a cluster of tiny cells on the right side of the figure and a much larger cell on the left. Remember that we said that our bodies are made of trillions of tiny cells. So the question to ask at this point is why? Why are our bodies composed of trillions of tiny cells as opposed to being one big huge cell? Take a moment and think about that question before moving on. Remember that cells are living things, and like all living things, cells need to eat. They have to get food. They need nutrients in order to grow and survive. But how do cells eat? Well, cells ingest food particles by allowing those particles to pass directly through the outer boundary of the cell. Once inside, those nutrients move to some point on the cell's interior where they can be used to generate some biochemical process that's necessary for the cell to sustain its life. Compare the large cell on the left-hand side of the figure with one of the smaller cells in the cluster on the right. Notice that the larger cell has much more stuff inside compared to the smaller cell. In a larger cell, it would take an extraordinary amount of time for nutrients to move through all of that stuff inside the cell to reach the point in the cell's interior where it's needed. With a smaller cell, nutrients are able to move through the cell and reach the point inside the cell where they're needed much more quickly, making this process more efficient. Another factor we have to consider when comparing large and small cells is the cell volume to surface area ratio, which is the amount of stuff inside the cell compared to the amount of space on the outside of the cell through which nutrients move into the cell. As a cell gets bigger, the amount of stuff inside the cell increases at a rate that is much faster than the outer perimeter of the cell can grow to accommodate this increasing cell volume. And because the cell is bigger, that means it needs more food. Because larger cells have such a large nutrient requirement, and because the amount of available space across which those nutrients can diffuse or move into the cell is minimal, it makes sense that larger cells have a much more difficult time obtaining the nutrients they need in order to grow and survive than do smaller cells. Again, take a close look at the cells in the figure. Notice that the overall surface area of the larger cell, in other words, the amount of space across which nutrients can diffuse, is 5,400 square micrometers, whereas the total surface area of the small cluster of cells is much larger, 16,000 squared micrometers. What this means is that smaller cells have a much greater area overall across which nutrients can move into the cell. In other words, smaller cells can more easily receive the nutrients they need to grow and survive than can larger cells. So eventually, as a cell grows, it will reach a point where it cannot consume enough nutrients to keep it living, so it will either die or split to form two smaller cells. Now, I know this concept can be a little confusing, and we'll talk more about the surface area to volume ratio when we discuss cell reproduction. But what you should gain from this information at this point is that our bodies are made of smaller cells because small cells are better able to receive nutrients and thus survive than are larger cells. Although there are differences in the cells that make up our bodies, cell biologists note that all human cells have three important regions. All cells have a nucleus, which is the control center of the cell, the brain of the cell. They all have a plasma membrane, the outer boundary of the cell that separates the external environment of the cell from the internal environment. And finally, all cells have cytoplasm, an intracellular matrix throughout which organelles are dispersed. Because of these similarities, we discuss the structure of a cell in terms of a general model called the composite cell. The figure you see here is a composite diagram of a typical animal cell. Notice that you can see the three main regions of the cell we just described. The nucleus is in the center, and the cytoplasm in this figure is the yellow material between the nucleus and the outer plasma membrane, shown here in blue. Notice also that there is quite a bit going on in this figure. It's kind of a busy diagram, and there's a lot to take in by looking at it. So before moving on, take a minute, familiarize yourself with the basic structure of the composite cell, and as you do so, compare the figure you see here with the figure of the composite cell you have on page 3 of your notes. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at the anatomy of the composite cell and discuss the functions of each of the major cell components.